Hello, I am Vladimir of Nations, Conflicted Militaries in Eastern Europe, 1450-1500, and Strategies of Ukrainian War, 1500-1800, that's currently in print with pen and sword. Today, the topic of my webinar is large cycles of combat. War is repeating. The title is maybe a lot of bit complicated, but you shall see that really the platform of today's discussion is very simple, and it's linked to today's reality of arrival of the new technologies in our everyday life, and of course in warfare, because warfare is a kind of social activity, a kind of humankind activity that absorbs, adopts, and uses the new capabilities, the new technologies first of all. I'm talking about the new technologies in warfare, in capabilities of armies and fleets, according to the historical evidence and according to the evidence of the cycles of the arrival of new technologies in warfare that I discussed, that I partly discovered in my last paper that's in open access with the Italian Society for Military History, and the title of this paper is Write the Large Cycles of Combat. I discussed the arrival of new technologies on the background of the key waves or long wave theory of the economic development and the development in general that were discovered by the Russian scientist Nikolai Kondratyev at the beginning of the 20th century, and that became the base of the theory of innovations of Joseph Schumpeter, on which the general theory of the current development of the global economy and especially of advanced capitalist economies is based. So, large cycles of combat, repeating patterns of war. You have before your eyes 4 depictions of apocalypses, 4 depictions of the apocalypse, that is the end time, in the imagination of the religious writers, on which apocalypse is depicted as war. And you can see that all depictions are similar, despite the fact that they were produced by the painters in the different epochs of the European development, and they are based on one and the same legend that was interpreted in different and in the same way, in the similar way. War that has its own laws and its own agents, and we can look on the various, on the equestrians of apocalypses as the agents of war that must be discussed to understand the situation with the arrival of new technologies in warfare and rotation of the warfare technological epochs. Why it is so important? I open a secret of the finish of this webinar, which consists of a fact that could be considered established, that we are on the eve of the arrival of new radical innovations in warfare that will soon determine the development, the profile of the current military conflicts, and maybe push to emergence the new military dominant powers in the global scale. You can see that despite difference of weaponry and difference of fighting environment. The painters of medieval past and the painters of modernity, they depict war with striking similarity. War is antagonistic conflict between the opponents. Each of them strives to impose its will on the enemy by destroying the enemy or subjugating it. And this specific situation of war, that war is one of the most antagonistic, maybe the most antagonistic kind of social activity. This special situation of war, that war is antagonistic, war is conflict between two or more sides, produce the laws of war. The economic development, social development, cultural development, and so on, they are not so antagonistic as war, because stakes of opposition of different sides in economic and social development are not so high as in war, because the stakes of confrontation in war are victory or defeat, destruction or survival of one of the opponents. And this radical antagonism, radical confrontation of war produce its special rules, special wars that we have to discuss when we discuss arrival of the new technologies, because the new technologies come into war that has its own rules. Discussing the new technologies, we have to turn our attention to periodization of history, periodization of war. Why periodization of war? Why division of war into different time ranges, into different periods is so important? Because only when we make this division of large social process like war into some distinctive epoch, we could find really important agents, factors, and forces that drive it, because we can understand what differs one epoch from another. And the most important factors of warfare are the forces that divide one epoch from another. During last 600-700 years, warfare developed from mechanic machines, throwing machines, bows, from cold steel weapon, into the epoch, into the current epoch of autonomous, unmanned fighting systems like aerial drones, into the weapon of long distance hitting of the enemy, into the weaponry in which the human participation is not so immediate like 700 years before. It is the reason why to compare warfare during all this period, we have to find a platform, a phenomenon that affords us to discuss warfare as an interrupted process with the same mainstay from the very beginning to the very end of the period that we research. And one of the most striking and maybe the most representative phenomenon of this long period of warfare is infantry. Infantry is a specific kind of forces, branch of forces, that during all this period, from the muscle and cold steel epoch in warfare to the current computerized long-distance efforts in warfare preserves its main feature, preserves its nature as a warfighting tool. But first, before discussing infantry, we have to discuss the theory of long waves to apply it as a tool, as an instrument for measurement of war during this long period. And the theory of long waves could be a very productive instrument because it has reputation of accuracy in describing economic events. Russian scientist Nikolai Kondratyev opened that economy develops according to long, from 5 to 7 decades long cycles. And every cycle repeats the pattern of the preceding cycle in appearance of innovations and their impact on economy and society. Kondratyev considered that the reason for the change of the economic epoch once in 50-70 years is the change of the technological foundation of the human society, change of economies, productive forces, appearance of the new technologies, new principles of organization of economy that changes preceding principles to something radical new. Kondratyev professed that not only technological and productive base of society changes every from 50 to 70 years, but everything in human society that has technological, productive component changes as well, including warfare, because the military technologies change with the same 50-70 years long periods as the productive foundation of the society, production foundation of economy. The Austrian scientist Joseph Schumpeter supported the theory of Nikolai Kondratyev. Both of them authored their concepts following collapse of their native lands, their motherlands, in warfare. Both motherland of Nikolai Kondratyev and motherland of Joseph Schumpeter, respectively Russian and Austrian empires, collapsed in the result of the First World War. And they researched the collapse, and then they traveled to the United States of America, where they found that collapse that their countries faced could be not a doom, but a beginning of the new development. And it is the observation in which the cyclical pattern to the economic and social development was found. War in the 20th century was an evidence of this cyclical development. But contrary to the ideas of Schumpeter and Kondratyev, the development of war in the 20th century was not technologically dependent. War was not directly linked to technology, and defeats of the technologically advanced armies repeated in the 20th century with suspicious regularity that demonstrated that the laws of war are not the laws of technological development. They are linked, but war is not dependent of technology. We know that, for example, defeat of the advanced technologically American army in Vietnam at the hands of much lower technologically developed Vietnamese army is an evidence that war process technology according to its own laws to make unpredictable outcome. Idea of the technological languages that really transform the human society from the preceding stage to the next stage. And it is the story how the idea of technological dominance of was born. However, not only the American experience in Vietnam, but also the Soviet experience in Afghanistan in the 1980s. And then again, the American experience in the same Afghanistan in 2000 and 2010 opened again the pattern that war not depend on the technologically more advanced armies suffered defeats at the hands of technologically much more inferior opponents. However, if not technology, what determines the rules of war? On what war depends? Nikolai Kondratiev and Schumpeter considered that war depends on economy, on transition, adoption of innovations from economy to warfare. Schumpeter urged the theory of clustering of innovations on the upswing stage of the long waves, and he found the facts together with other scholars that on the upswing phases of the long waves of economic and social development or Kondratic waves, wars become more destructive for the civil population, and military losses in the battles and other engagements escalate as well. It was a great argument to synchronize war with technological and economic development with the long waves, but they are not self-evident. There are another points of view that subordinate war politics. There is very famous slogan of Clausewitz, Karl von Clausewitz, who enunciated the general theory of war at the beginning of the 19th century. Clausewitz affirmed that war is continuation of politics, but as a means. But this translation of the word politics is very special, because it's only one of interpretation of the German term with which Clausewitz operated. Another prominent military thinkers and practitioners, such as Russian Vladimir Lenin, who established Soviet Union on the civil war in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century, and Chinese Mao Zedong, who established the contemporary China on the Chinese Civil War in the middle of the 20th century, they professed another interpretation of Clausewitz's phrase. They consider that war depends not on politics. Lenin stressed that war is continuation not of politics as general system of struggle over power by different social groups and political factions, but the current war at hand, is the continuation of the current policy as the special action of some political forces to achieve some objectives. And this point of view is much more accurate than translation that war is dependent of politics, because of course the current policy determines the objectives of war when it changes into war, into the projection of force. Mao Zedong, who has a great military experience leading the Chinese communist forces in their struggle against Japanese intervention and Chinese native forces of reaction, he professed the idea that war has its own laws that started to work, to dominate, as soon as this switch of policy to war from peaceful tools of struggle over power to armed instruments of struggle over power happens. And Mao Zedong professes this idea, basing it on the same similar idea of Clausewitz. Clausewitz not only established dependence of the current war from the current policy, he also revealed two very important definitions in the theory of war. One of them is the nature of war, and another of them is the character of war. Two different definitions. Nature of war, from the point of view of Clausewitz, consisted in work of two different groups of factors. First factor is interaction of the people that wage war, government of the country that wage war, and army that fight the war. One of these three factors could be leading in the current situation and produce different kinds of warfare. Nature of war is the same, but on this nature, the currents of warfare are different. For example, the technological foundation of the French army before the Great French Revolution at the end of the 18th century and armies of the revolutionary France and Napoleonic France were the same. Their technological base was the same. But change of the government, of the absolutist government, at the head of the French military before the revolution, into the people, revolutionary people of France, as a leading factor in the nature of war, changed the character of war, changed the forms of military action, changed operational art, strategy, tactics of the forces, changed in war almost everything. And it was the switch of the leading factor in the nature of war that produced the phenomenon of Napoleon. Similar situations are repeating in history fast. Another group of factors is the group of offense-defense balance. In different epochs, due to technological, organizational, and tactical development, different forms of military action and most different forms, opposing forms of military action are offense and defense, attack and defense. They could, one of them, prevail over another with the same weapons. In different epochs, offense or defense could prevail. For example, First World War was the epoch in which defense prevailed over offense. But after reorganization of the armies in the interwar period, generation of new military ideas such as operational art, idea of deep operations, idea of German blitzkrieg, almost with the same technique, with the same technological base of the armies, attack prevailed over defense. And it was, this phenomenon became first a base for the German military successes to destroy Poland, to destroy France, then to effectively attack the Soviet Union. And then it became the base for the Soviet Union's research in fighting back the Germans and Soviet deep advance into Germany and destruction of its military forces and its Nazi statehood. These two groups of factors, nature of war as an interaction of people, government and army, and offense-defense balance, they interact between each other, and they also interact with the environment, with the technologies, with the current politics, with the geopolitical situation, geographical factors, factors of ideology and morale. And interaction of all these factors produce different, specific, particular character of every war. And character of war is a compound into which the external technologies come to work, to function. And it is very important moment because character of war interacting with technologies determine how they change warfare. It means giving victory or defeat to one or another side of the conflict. When I researched the cycles of the Russian infantry, now we come back to infantry, from the emergence of Muscovy at the end of the 14th century to today, I opened that there were 12 epochs from 50 to 70 years, distinctive epochs. In each of them, the radical change of character of war that the Russian infantry waged happened. Why infantry? Infantry is highly characteristic kind of military forces or branch of arms, highly different from other branches of arms. Infantry is basically the same today as it was in the first cave depictions of fighting that we know, because infantry preserves the same character of a contact warfare. If, for example, artillery that emerged in the 14th century, gunpowder artillery, moved from the direct interaction with the enemy, from the direct hitting, to the remote fighting with the distantly guided munition, infantry preserved its ability for the contact fighting. And we could find on the body cameras of the modern infantrymen the same shots, for example, of knife fighting, as we could find in the medieval depictions. And now you have before your eyes two different episodes. One of them is the late medieval or early modern depiction of the Russian taking of Kazan, the capital of the Muslim Tatar Khanate in the middle Volga region. And another depiction is a body camera shot from the current fighting in Donbass. Both of them depict knife fighting because between highly motivated opposing infantrymen and highly skilled. And both pictures demonstrate the same vigor to kill, annihilate the enemy in the close contact, eyes to eyes, that other kinds of troops are deprived of. It means that infantry was and still is the principal demonstration, example, how the nature of war, that motivation, government with its ability to mobilize, and army with its skills, infantry embody this nature of war, and infantry embody, connect, offense, defense balance, because infantry fight close combat against the enemy. The infantry fight is highly individual. It was highly individual in the last year time, from which I started my research on the cycle of Russian infantry. And infantry has this character of individual fight, individual combat today. That other kinds of branch of arms have, for example, aviation. Infantry weapon today is individual weaponry. If in aviation or in artillery, the technological characteristics of the weapon integrate different variables in one cluster of warfare, infantry combat is still individual, and integration of the infantrymen happens due to their discipline, to their training, and to the commander to the power, to the discipline of the commander over them, not like in aviation and artillery. So infantry is a phenomenon of warfare that could be researched from today to late medieval time with the same principal characteristics to discover the laws of war, to discover the factors that rotate the large cycles of combat. I would not repeat characteristics of the main cycles of development of the Russian infantry from the late medieval time to today. But I point out your attention to one very interesting phenomenon. Its appearance of the military technological innovations or organizational innovations or tactical innovations on the last phase of the long cycle before the next cycle use them to produce radically different pattern of warfare. It's very important phenomenon because today we have before our eyes arrival of the artificial intelligence into warfare. The preceding cycle of the military development that is finishing today was the cycle of the revolution in military affairs. It was started with appearance of high precision, long range weapons and deep reconnaissance of the battlefield with different kinds of optical, sound, sensors, radars, and so on. So battlefield becomes transparent and high precision weaponry provides two more accurate but these new kinds of weapons did not produce radically new kinds of warfare until now. But today, the arrival of the artificial intelligence looks like the tools, the organizational instrument to use the tools of revolution of military affairs to produce the radical new way of war. First, the artificial intelligence starts to coordinate high precision weapons and deep reconnaissance of the battlefield. We know from the Israeli experience of fighting in time and from Russian-Ukrainian war and other intelligence really administer command over the high precision weaponry and deep reconnaissance of the battlefield better than the human beings, faster and more effective and often with more severe, with more harsh way. At the same time, artificial intelligence comes to the field of military simulation. First of all, it's used to educate, to train, to instruct the militaries in the skills of current combat. And artificial intelligence produce different scenarios, different scripts of military events in case if this or that factor come to connect into the new pattern in which artificial intelligence becomes the new organizer of warfare in its broad sense, the new organizer of war, from mobilization of the national resources, their training, their preparation for military activity, to planning and conduct of the military operations, and to running, controlling the weapons. And this new pattern of war is on the eve of merging warfare. However, another interesting fact that I opened during my research on the cycles of the Russian infantry from emergence of Muscovy to today is that to be adopted for warfare, the new pattern needs that some new political and organizational changes and changes in society, the new military technologies for use. So we are on the eve of appearance of the new patterns of society to make the new military innovations effective. The same changes like gunpowder revolution brought when it changed the estate late medieval monarchies into absolutist military states of the early modern period. And we are on the eve of the same changes. What kind of changes? We face them soon. I am Vladimir Shirogorov, a historian, and author of the books War on the Eve of Nations, Conflicting Militaries in Eastern Europe, 1450-1500, and Strategies of Ukrainian War, 1500-1800, that is currently in print, with pen and sword, the United Kingdom, and many other books and essays published in Russia, the United States, Germany, Italy, and other countries. I invite you to watch and discuss my video stories about the military development, and I wish you the best in the new year. Goodbye.